Thank you, Coriana. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I don't know if you can see me. I'm going to stop my video now anyway, so we can focus on the presentation. I hope everyone's had a delicious lunch, and I'm delighted to be opening this afternoon's session. So when we looked at the initial ideas and the list of ideas for the presentations for this day, we noticed that almost all of the talks focused on single species or monitoring programs at the Valley Domain. And what we felt was missing was a talk bringing all these elements together, showing the connections and taking a broader ecosystem perspective. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to both take a step back and a step closer to try to show you the bigger picture with some extra details. And I'd like to focus on Praslin's palm forest as a whole, because although we're here today to celebrate 40 years of UNESCO status for Valley Domain, Praslin's incredible coco de mer dominated palm forest covers a much greater area than just the UNESCO reserve, as Joshua nicely showed earlier. It encompasses parts of the Praslin National Park, including Fontpépin, plus Font Ferdinand, and each of these palm forest areas needs management and connections with the other areas to survive. So we need to think of this habitat and indeed manage it as a connected area. Now, this is not a research talk. It brings together findings and insights to try to convince you, if you aren't already persuaded, that this unique habitat is an ecological treasure that needs even more research and conservation attention than it's already receiving. So I'm going to start by asking everyone, what do you think of when you think of the palm forest? Maybe you think straight away of the Valley Domain and the coco de mer, or maybe it's the endemic palms as a group, or perhaps it's the black parrot, or maybe the many colourful geckos at the site, or maybe it's something more people-oriented, like the visitors or the many children and other people who have been inspired by the fantastic education programme at the site. Do you know what I think of? Dinosaurs. Yep. And this is not as daft as it might sound. So as Annabelle showed so well this morning, we're sitting here on fragments of Gondwana, an ancient supercontinent that definitely had dinosaurs and palms. Seychelles was isolated from the rest of Gondwana before the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, so it's entirely plausible that the Seychelles Plateau once had dinosaurs. And why is this relevant? Mainly, as well as putting in a picture of dinosaurs, is because it gives context to everything I'm going to talk about today in terms of the ancientness of this ecosystem and the fact that the species in it have evolved together for tens of millions of years. So starting here with the coco de mer, another giant of evolution. The coco de mer plays the most important role in this forest. We've already heard all about recent research on coco de mer in the last session, its growth, its population size, and its genetics. But what I want to focus on is its position in the palm forest ecosystem. And the coco de mer is a keystone species. And that means it's important for and has impacts on the whole ecosystem. Without it, the system, like the proverbial bridge of the keystone, can collapse. So let's think about what makes it a keystone species. Consider how many other species depend on the coco de mer. There are the obvious ones, all the animals attracted to the curious smelling pollen that is produced by the male catkins in enormous quantities. This part of the plant alone is one of the most important food resources in this forest, attracting 5 gecko species and a wide range of invertebrates, from mollusks like the white slugs to insects like flies, bees, and beetles. The pollen is basically a super resource in a habitat where nutrients are actually very scarce. And then there's the female flowers, which, when receptive, also provide food in the form of nectar. So here you can see a Phelsuma striata at the top and a giant bronze gecko at the bottom, both attracted to the nectar. But we also know from observations and camera traps that all species of Phelsuma and bronze gecko feed on this nectar, as well as slugs, crickets, and other invertebrates. So now let's look at the leaves. Coco de Mer leaves are some of the largest in the plant kingdom and form multi-layered and huge, stable platforms and hanging points for a range of wildlife, from chameleons, geckos, snakes, and tree frogs, to snails, crickets, leaf and stick insects, praying mantis, and much more. Even the leaf stems, or petioles, and the trunks host a huge range of fauna, with similar species found here as on the leaves. Now, some species, like these endemic stylodonta snails and wolf spiders at the bottom left, seem to prefer these parts of the tree. White slugs are also common on the petioles, and their role isn't fully understood, but we do know that they're also dependent on the Coco de Mer. Of the different geckos, some of which I've shown here, they stratify their hangout places by height. So you tend to see smaller geckos like Phelsuma striata and Aeluronix tachyscopius on the lowest parts of the trunks and petioles, and the largest, Phelsuma sumbergi and Aeluronix trachygaster, at the top, where the resources are most plentiful. Even the spaces in between the trunks are used. The palm spiders, for example, build their sticky webs in these gaps. And not forgetting the vital ground layer. So when those immense leaves fall off the tree, after several years, they eventually crash to the ground, where they join a complex, dense leaf litter composed of many layers of these tough leaves and their fibers, which can take years to rot away. Now, the labyrinth-like structure of this leaf litter is very different to broadleaf litter and forms really its own micro-ecosystem. This is where we find the 3 species of endemic skink, including the 2 elusive burrowing skinks, which take advantage of the thickly layered habitat to find food and hide from predators. Plus, of course, the Praslin Saglostis frog, the tree frog, the Seychelles house snake, at least 5 species of Cecilian in the lower layers, crabs, crickets, wolf spiders, and again, many other invertebrates. So this is a rich habitat that is unique to the Praslin palm forest. So here's that layer of leaf litter from a distance. So you can really see how these layers build up. But as well as that, there's another way that even dead Coco de Mers are important for the ecosystem. Now, dead trees form cavities in their trunks, which are, of course, used by black parrots to nest in. And this seems to be the parrot's preferred nest tree species, although we now know that they also nest in many other species. But it nicely shows that all parts of the Coco de Mer and all parts of its life and death cycle are crucial to maintain a thriving palm forest ecosystem. So, taking all of this into account, we have a species which is either essential for or supports the survival of at least 20 vertebrate species and many, many invertebrate species. So one way to think of the Coco de Mer is like a 5-star, all-inclusive hotel where animals can find food, shelter, protection from predators, social areas, and breeding grounds. Now, not only is the Coco de Mer a keystone species, it is also an ecosystem engineer, which means it can modify its own ecosystem, in this case, benefiting its offspring, which means that this tree is one of very few examples of maternal care in a plant. Now, shown here is a diagram from a fantastic paper published in 2015 by Peter Edwards et al. So this is the work mentioned in the Q&A session earlier. I'm quite happy to be able to go into it in further detail now. So starting at the top, what you can see is that the Coco de Mer leaves act as a giant funnel, intercepting up to 100% of rainfall over the palm forest canopy. This rain then cascades down the petioles and the trunks, which are effective drain pipes, and as it gushes down the trunk, the water carries with it debris from pollen and other organic matter. So when it reaches the ground, these nutrients, which are a precious resource in this nutrient-poor system, are directed down to the roots of the tree and the growing seedlings around it. Now, this creates nutrient-rich and moist soil very close to the tree, perfect conditions for young Coco de Mers, which often germinate right next to the mother tree. But the effect is very localized, so even just 1 meter away from the base of the tree, the nutrient resources are already dwindling. So with this in mind, these are pictures from the Valley Domain, and this is what we think of as a dense coco de mer palm forest today. But given what we now know, in an even more natural situation, coco de mers would have grown even more densely. So with nuts that are dispersed only by gravity, any that don't roll downhill will germinate right next to the mother. In most cases, Emma's graph earlier showed some exceptions there. Now, mother trees obviously produce lots of nuts, so you're probably not too far off if you imagine an original palm forest habitat as a real thicket of coco de mer trunks and juveniles, with a canopy so dense and highly connected that many species would never need to come to the ground. The canopy would have intercepted virtually all rainfall over the forest, concentrating it and the nutrients around the trunks. Now, you're probably wondering at this point why I'm giving another talk on coco de mer when we've already had 3. Well, that's because it's really impossible to talk about the ecosystem as a whole without focusing on coco de mer. But I'm really showing all of this to highlight how important the species is for all the other species in the palm forest. Now, one species in particular appears to be more closely co-evolved with coco de mer than any other, and this is our ancient and enigmatic friend, the giant bronze gecko, Aeolonyx trachygaster. I can pick up on the earlier discussion here because we're now confident that this giant gecko is the main pollinator of the coco de mer. This is the result of years of field research, observations, and analysis led by Chris Bunbury, and this ruled out, one by one, all the other potential pollinators, namely smaller geckos, insects, and wind. And the work has also involved many people sitting in this room, and it's a vital relationship to know about because these 2 island giants appear to be mutually dependent on each other. So the giant gecko pollinates coco de mer and appears to be the main means of gene dispersal of the palm, since the seeds really can't travel very far in most cases. And all the evidence suggests that trachygaster is also dependent on coco de mer forest as its only habitat. It has never been seen in any other habitat as far as we know, and its preferred location is up in the canopy, where it's usually observed on coco de mer catkins or female flowers. So co-evolved mutualisms like this mean that if we lose one species, the other is also likely to be lost at some point. And if one of these species declines, the other will follow. So we're coming back to curias now, because one unfortunate example of this comes from curias, where there is a coco de mer population, but there's no trachygaster. Instead, Phelsuma sunbergi has stepped in as the main pollinator, but it's a much less effective one. So the coco de mer population struggles and remains patchy. There are also genetic implications of this, as Emma really nicely showed earlier on. So in degraded habitat like curias and some parts of Praslin, where there are no trachygaster, pollen dispersal seems to be substantially reduced, and we see a much higher frequency of abnormal nuts, seen here at the bottom left. So in the picture on the bottom right, a really crucial point to note here is that as a consequence of this patchy distribution, there's minimal connectivity of the canopy, which means that the leaves of most coco de mers are connected to very few others. Potential pollinators can't easily get from tree to tree and may need to cross open ground. And one thing we've seen about trachygaster is when we have seen it on the ground, it's incredibly clumsy and very vulnerable. It really needs this mature, dense, and highly connected coco de mer forest that now occurs in only a few places on Praslin. Moving on to another really well-connected species. We all know and love the black parrot, and you'll be hearing much more about SIF's work on them shortly. All I want to talk about is what connects the parrots to their environment. So black parrots feed on more than 50 plant species, including all the endemic palms, except coco de mer. They are primarily frugivores, so they prefer fruit and, of course, the seeds in those fruit. Feeding encounters on native palms are shown here along the top and include Nephrosperma, Furschfeltia, Paragonipa, and Dicenia, among many others. But they also eat introduced species. And along the bottom, we can see parrots feeding on papaya, mango, starfruit, and an introduced Syzygium species. And we know from research that the parrots prefer to eat native species, and endemic palms top the list. The parrots probably also disperse many of these species, although this hasn't been studied so far. And parrots used to be considered almost entirely seed predators, meaning that very few seeds would survive being chomped up and digested in order to germinate afterwards. But parrots, and notably the Chorocopsis genus, which the black parrot belongs to, are now known to be important seed dispersers and excellent seed dispersers. So they do this by carrying fruit with their feet and their beaks, which you can see them doing here, in fact, rather than via gut passage like many species do. But this is quite an important leap forward in our understanding of their contribution to the ecosystem, and it means that parrots are probably vital, along with several other species, for native palm recruitment. But the black parrot is only one seed disperser. There are several other frugivores in the palm forest, including blue pigeons, Seychelles bulbuls, and fruit bats. Now, these haven't been studied in detail either, but we know from other Seychelles sites how important they are as seed dispersers. What all of this hopefully starts to illustrate is the whole picture of the connectivity of this amazing ecosystem, and that we can't look at things in isolation. So to illustrate this even more, I'm going to show you an attempt at a very rough food web I've drawn for the palm forest native species. This is, so purists might want to look away because this is not quantified or based on research, but it's from observations and literature. So here it is. Hopefully everybody can see this. It's also simplified. There's obviously a lot more in it than this. And it's an unusual food web. If you're an ecologist, you can see that quite quickly. It lacks a central top predator, and it has only one connected mammal, which is a frugivore, the fruit bat down at the right, our bottom right here. So the community is not controlled from the top down, but from the bottom up by the limited resources, mostly provided by Coco de Mer. So this reflects a general pattern across islands where top predators are missing or less dominant. But here, the reliance of the community on just this one species is really significant. Now, the whole system is under threat from introduced species like the ants, rats, cats, tenrecs, and more recently, myna birds. So all of these have potential to disrupt these dynamics, potentially permanently. So the palm forest desperately still needs more research, but we really need to understand pollination, seed dispersal, nutrient cycling, and crucially, impacts of invasive species on the way the community works. So despite all of the monitoring and the research done in the last 15 years, there are still many unanswered questions, and we're still on the surface in terms of understanding how the palm forest ecosystem works. Nonetheless, I really hope that this talk has drawn attention to the bigger picture and all the ecological connections of this unique habitat, and perhaps also change the way you think about Praslin's palm forest. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. All the Value May research team who, over the years add so much to our understanding of everything, and all SIF colleagues and research collaborators, and the people who have given SIF their incredible photos that helped illustrate this. Thank you very much, everyone.